September 2007 on Îles Aigrettes, a scrap of coral limestone in the Indian Ocean off Mauritius. 15 giant tortoises are lowered from wooden crates onto bare, cracked ground, a stone's throw from a fence that cost $12 million and had for 6 years protected a forest that was quietly dying anyway. If you love these wildlife comeback and rewilding stories, subscribe and hit the bell. There are more of these comeback stories than you'd believe. Now, that fence was no ordinary fence. A 2-mile ring of galvanized steel and buried mesh, sunk deep enough to stop a rat from tunneling under and tall enough to keep out goats and the careless feet of people. It kept the destroyers out, and for 6 years behind it, almost nothing new grew. The old trees kept toppling, an ebony here, a hardwood there, laid down by the wind, and none rose to take their place. No saplings, no fresh green pushing up through the leaf litter. Just the old giants falling, one by one, onto ground that would not answer. The most expensive conservation fence on Earth was protecting a corpse. Picture it, the most expensive conservation fence on Earth, and behind it, nothing growing. A fortune in steel, wrapped around a forest that was still slowly dying. Here's the strange part. When the tortoises went in, everyone assumed the hard question was whether the animals themselves would survive. The heat, the thin soil, the unfamiliar island. Survival was supposed to be the difficult bit. That's not what the researchers ended up arguing about. Because what the trees did next, what they did entirely on their own in the space of about 18 months, is a thing a 2019 paper in the journal PNAS still hedges around, still circles carefully. Nobody fully agrees how 15 slow ancient reptiles managed in a year and a half what a fortune in fencing couldn't manage in 6 years. Hold that gap in your mind for a moment. 15 tortoises, $12 million, and the animals won. I'm Peter, and this is the full story of how 15 giant tortoises made a $12 million fence useless and healed a forest by eating it. Over the next while, I'll walk you through it properly, how the forest collapsed in the first place, the strange mechanism at the heart of all this that most people have genuinely never heard of, the release itself, and the hard data that came afterwards, because once you see the mechanism, you can't unsee it. It changes how you look at a forest, but it starts with the animal, and the animal you're picturing, the plodding, wrinkled, faintly comic giant tortoise, is not what it is on these islands. Here it has a proper name, the Aldabra giant tortoise, Aldabrachelis gigantea. 1/2 meter of domed shell, a neck like old rope, a mouth built to crush. On an island like this one, it was never just an inhabitant, never just a thing that happened to live in the forest. It was the gardener, the plough, and the postman all at once, a walking engineer that shaped the whole system, quietly, over centuries. Hold on to that word, engineer, because it's the whole story. And to understand why the fence failed, you have to understand what humans took out of this forest 2 centuries ago. Not the goats, not the rats the fence was built to stop. Something invisible, the one animal that made the whole forest able to reproduce at all. That invisible thing was the tortoise itself. Mauritius and its islets once carried their own giant tortoises, ancient reptiles that had trundled across this coral limestone for millions of years. And then the ships came, sailors and settlers ate them. By the early 1800s, they were gone, every last one, swallowed into the same hunger that took the dodo. The last of them vanished within a single human lifetime. And here is the thing people always get wrong. The goats, the rats, the trampling human feet, the destroyers the $12 million fence was actually built to keep out, those came later. They were real and they did damage, but they were only part of the wound. The deepest cut had already been made 2 centuries earlier, and no fence in the world could touch it. Because the tortoise wasn't just an animal that lived in this forest, it was the animal the forest was built around. And to understand that, you have to look at the fruit. The native ebonies and hardwoods on Îlots Aigrettes make a very particular kind of fruit. Big, hard, thick-skinned. Look at one of those ebony fruits, heavy in the palm, far too large for any bird on this island to swallow. Ask yourself, what was it built for? It was built for a gut, a tortoise's gut specifically. The fruit is designed to be eaten whole, scoured through the animal's slow digestive tract, and carried, sometimes hundreds of meters, before the seed is dropped, cleaned and scarified, in a pat of dung far from its parent. That was the deal. The tree fed the tortoise. The tortoise planted the tree. A gardener, a plough, and a postman, all in one shell. Now take that animal away. Without the eater, the fruit still falls, but it falls straight down. It piles up beneath the parent tree in a thick, rotting mat, seed on seed on seed, so dense that almost nothing can sprout through it. The forest keeps making its fruit faithfully every year, and every year that fruit dies at its own feet. Botanists have a name for this. They call it a dispersal ghost, a forest whose reproduction machine has lost its one moving part. Everything else still works. The trees still flower. They still fruit. But the single component that carried those seeds out into the light is gone, and the whole system just quietly grinds to a halt. Here's the part that genuinely unsettled the researchers. The forest wasn't dying of neglect, it was dying of loneliness, for one missing animal. Think about what that means for the fence. The steel stopped the goats, the buried mesh stopped the rats. It kept the human feet off the ground. It did, honestly, everything it was designed to do. But it could not restart the machine. It couldn't pick up a single fallen fruit and walk it into the open. That was the part the engineers never priced in. Which brings us to a Mauritian ecologist named Christine Griffiths, and an idea so simple it sounds almost like cheating. The original tortoise was extinct. You can't bring back what's gone, but you can find its closest living cousin, the Aldabra giant tortoise, still grazing in its thousands out on Aldabra Atoll, hundreds of kilometers to the north. Same appetite, same slow jaws, same shape of a job. Ecologists call this an ecological stand-in, or an analog species, a substitute animal brought in to do the vanished one's work. And the plan was not a nursery, not machinery, not another cent of that $12 million. The whole plan was a reptile with an appetite. Put the animal back, get out of the way. So they lowered the 15 tortoises inside, closed the crates, stepped back, and then everyone waited. 18 months later, the ground behind the useless fence had begun to do something the 6 years of steel never could: grow. On bare limestone that had refused everything for 6 years, young native ebony seedlings began pushing up through the soil, not one or two, but in numbers that made the field team stop and count twice, so they counted properly. A survey by the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation set out quadrats across the island, plots of measured ground, and compared them. In the fenced tortoise-free control plots, the ones the fence had been built to protect, the seedlings barely appeared. Almost nothing, the same dense mat of dead fruit, the same rot, the same stillness. But in the plots where the tortoises walked and fed and left their dung, native ebony seedlings were germinating at rates the control plots never came close to touching. 18 months, read that again. 18 months of slow reptiles beat 6 years of steel and $12 million. The most expensive fence on earth had held the corpse in place. 15 tortoises brought it back to life, seed by seed, walking. The fence didn't fail because it broke. It failed because it was the wrong tool. It was never the goats or the rats that killed the forest's future. It was the missing animal. And a fence, however perfect, cannot be an animal. Here is where the story gets genuinely strange, and where the scientists start to disagree. How exactly did 15 tortoises do it? A 2019 paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, PNAS, laid out the effect in hard numbers, but hedged carefully around the mechanism, because no one fully agrees which part matters most. There are 3 suspects. The first is the gut. When a tortoise swallows that hard ebony fruit and grinds it, the acid and the scouring wear down the seed coat, softened, primed, ready to sprout in a way a seed rotting under its parent never is. The second is the drop-off. A tortoise doesn't stay put. It carries the seed away from the killing mat and leaves it out on open, sunlit ground, where a seedling actually has a chance. And the third is the dung itself. A small package of fertilizer wrapped around every seed, delivered exactly where it's needed. Gut, journey, fertilizer. The scouring, the carrying, the feeding. Which one does the heavy lifting? That's what they still argue about. The dispersal ghost, the forest that lost its one moving part, got the part back, and no one had fully predicted how well it would work. I want to be honest about what this does not solve. Île aux Aigrettes is barely 50 acres. This is a rescue on a raft, not a continent. A single scrap of coral in a vast ocean, and the world is not made of 50-acre islands. And the animal doing the work, the Aldabra giant tortoise, is a substitute, not the original. Mauritius's own giant tortoises are gone forever. This is their cousin standing in. Whether a stand-in is ever truly the same as the animal that evolved with these trees, that's contested, and it always will be. But the ebonies are coming back. That much the ground itself is proving. On the island now, the workers have a word for the animals that did what the money couldn't. Not pests, not pets, not exhibits behind a fence. Gardeners, the plough that turns the soil, the postman that carries the seed, the engineer that was there all along, waiting to be let back in. They aren't the patients here, they're the medicine. Tell me the comeback story that stayed with you, down in the comments, the one that made you believe a broken place could heal, because that, to me, is the heart of it. Sometimes the fix isn't more engineering, more steel, more money. Sometimes it's returning the one moving part we removed, and then having the humility to step back. Picture them again, September 2007. 15 giant tortoises on cracked, empty ground, beside 2 miles of silent, redundant fence. And subscribe. There are more of these comeback stories than you'd believe. Thanks for watching.